Right, let's dive in today. We're tackling the Phillips curve.
Yeah.
You know that economic theory that usually explains the relationship between
Yeah.
inflation and unemployment. But
Yeah.
here's the thing. It's been acting kind of strangely lately.
It has.
You throw in President Trump's surprise 2025 tariffs.
Uh-huh.
Things get really interesting.
What's fascinating is how this seemingly simple concept,
Yeah.
that low unemployment usually equals higher inflation,
Right.
and vice versa, gets all shaken up when you toss in things like global pandemics and these like huge policy shifts.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's like the economy is playing by a different set of rules.
Right.
So let's rewind a bit.
Okay.
How did this whole Phillips curve thing even come about?
Or picture this. It's 1958.
Okay.
An economist named A.W. Phillips is looking at a century's worth of data from the UK. And what he finds is a pattern. When unemployment is low, wages tend to rise quickly.
Okay.
When unemployment is high, wage growth slows down. It's a classic supply and demand situation.
Right.
More jobs mean employers need to compete for workers, so they got to drive those wages up.
Okay. That makes sense. But
Yeah.
I thought the Phillips curve was about inflation in general, not just wages.
You're right. It evolved.
Okay.
Economists like Paul Samuelson and Robert Solow, they took Phillips' initial observation about wages
Okay.
and expanded it to look at overall inflation.
Okay.
They figured that rising wages often lead to higher prices for goods and services
Right.
across the board.
Got it. So for a while, it seemed like governments could use this Phillips curve
Yeah.
to guide their economic policies.
Right.
Keep unemployment low, even if it means risking a little inflation, or
Oh, yeah.
prioritize stable prices, even if it means some people are out of work. Tough choices.
Exactly.
But then came the 1970s,
Uh-oh.
and suddenly the economy threw everyone a curveball.
Literally.
We got hit with stagflation,
Oh, yeah.
high inflation and high unemployment at the same time.
At the same time.
It was like the Phillips curve just went out the window.
Oof.
Yeah, those oil shocks back then were a real mess.
Total mess.
But hold on, are you telling me economists just abandoned the Phillips curve after that?
Not quite.
Okay.
It sparked a whole new wave of thinking. Economists started exploring other factors
Okay.
that could explain why the stagflation was happening.
Okay.
One idea that emerged was this rational expectations theory.
Okay.
Think of it this way. If everyone expects prices to keep rising,
Uh-huh.
they'll just change their behavior.
Okay.
They'll ask for higher wages, buy things now before they get even more expensive.
Right.
And that can actually fuel more inflation.
So it's like our expectations about the future can
Yeah.
actually influence what happens in the present.
It really is.
That's wild.
It highlights the psychological side of economics.
Wow.
And then you've got the natural rate hypothesis,
Okay.
which basically argues that there is a certain level of unemployment that's kind of baked into the economy's structure,
Okay.
regardless of inflation. Things like labor laws, worker productivity, technological advancements
Yeah.
all play a role.
Okay, so it sounds like the original Phillips curve,
Yeah.
while groundbreaking at the time, needed some serious updating.
It did.
But how does it apply to what we're seeing today?
Right.
I mean, the world has changed a lot since the 1970s.
That's the key question.
Yeah.
In recent years, economists have been debating whether the Phillips curve has become flatter.
Flatter.
Imagine drawing the curve on a graph.
Right.
If it's flatter, it means the relationship between inflation and unemployment
Yeah.
is weaker than it used to be.
Okay.
Yeah.
Why would that happen?
Well, globalization is a big factor.
Okay.
In today's interconnected world, prices and wages aren't just influenced by what's happening locally. Then there's technology, automation, changing the nature of work,
Right.
how businesses operate. And lastly, there's this idea of anchored inflation expectations.
Okay.
Central banks like the Federal Reserve have gotten pretty good at managing inflation,
Right.
making people generally expect it to stay relatively stable.
So if people expect inflation to be controlled, it weakens that trade-off the Phillips curve originally described.
Exactly.
Like, we're less likely to panic and make things worse by, like, demanding huge raises.
Yeah,
Or going on crazy shopping sprees if we think prices will stay in check.
you got it.
Okay.
But then along came the pandemic,
Oh, yeah.
and everything got even more complicated.
Yeah.
Supply chains went haywire, leading to inflation even when unemployment was high.
Right.
Then as things started to reopen, we saw labor shortages and wage pressures pushing inflation up further.
Right. It felt like we were getting hit from all sides.
Totally.
And now we have this whole other layer of complexity
Right.
with President Trump's 2025 tariffs. I have a feeling this is where things take a turn.
It definitely adds a new wrinkle to the story.
Okay.
Remember, tariffs essentially act as a tax on imported goods,
Right.
making those goods more expensive for businesses and consumers here in the U.S.
So if things like electronics and cars become more expensive because of those tariffs, wouldn't that lead to
higher prices for everyone? Exactly.
Okay.
It's a classic example of cost push inflation,
right?
Where rising production costs drive up prices.
Okay.
Not necessarily because people are demanding more goods.
So that's the inflation side of the equation.
Right.
But weren't these tariffs supposed to be good for American jobs?
It's not that simple.
Okay.
While some domestic industries might benefit from tariffs because they make foreign competition more expensive, it's not a win for everyone.
Okay.
Think about all the companies that rely on imported parts or materials.
Yeah.
Those tariffs are going to make their costs go up, which could lead to layoffs or slower hiring.
And what about companies that export their goods? If other countries retaliate with their own tariffs, that could hurt American businesses too, right?
Absolutely. It's a ripple effect. Right. And the impacts can be felt far beyond the specific industries targeted by the tariffs.
So we've got globalization, technology, the pandemic, and now these tariffs.
All influencing how the Phillips curve behaves.
It's a lot to wrap our heads around.
It is.
What does this mean for the Phillips curve in the short term?
Well, these tariffs could make that trade-off between inflation and unemployment even more pronounced. We could see higher inflation because of those rising import costs and higher unemployment in industries hurt by the tariffs.
Right.
It's a recipe for something a lot like the stagflation we saw in the 1970s.
So potentially not so good news in the short term.
Yeah.
What about the long term?
Yeah.
Any chance these tariffs shake things up in a more fundamental way?
That's a great question, and it leads us to some even deeper questions about how the economy is evolving and what it means for the future. But before we get into that, let's take a closer look at how these tariffs could reshape certain industries.
All right, let's do it. Picking up where we left off, these tariffs have the potential to really shake things up. We were just talking about how they could make that inflation and employment balancing act even trickier. But how about the bigger picture? Could these tariffs actually reshape industries in the long run?
It's definitely a possibility. If businesses start adapting to these tariffs by, say, bringing production back to the U.S., we could see some long-term structural shifts.
So instead of relying on global supply chains, we might see more companies making things here in the U.S.
Yeah.
That's what they call reshoring, right?
Exactly. And if that happens, it could have a ripple effect on everything, from jobs to technology to how the Phillips curve itself behaves.
Now, hang on a sec. Before we get too far ahead of ourselves, let's go back to that question we posed earlier. Is the Phillips curve, even with all the updates and nuances we've discussed, still a relevant tool for understanding today's economy?
It's a valid question. And the answer, like most things in economics, isn't a simple yes or no. Think of it like this. The Phillips curve is a bit like an old map. It might not show every new road and building, but it still gives you a general sense of the lay of the land. It provides a framework for understanding how inflation and unemployment interact, even if we need to adjust our thinking based on current events and long-term trends.
Okay, so maybe it's not obsolete, but we need to use it with a healthy dose of skepticism, knowing that the real world is always going to be more complicated than any model.
Exactly. And for policymakers, that means taking a much more holistic approach. They can't just focus on that traditional Phillips curve trade-off. They need to consider global events, technological advancements, even things like consumer psychology.
Consumer psychology. Now, how does that fit into all this?
Well, remember how we talked about anchored inflation expectations?
Right.
If people believe prices are going to keep rising, they might demand higher wages or buy things sooner to beat the price hikes. And that can actually create a self-fulfilling prophecy, pushing inflation up even further. It's like a feedback loop.
It's almost like the economy is partly driven by our collective mood. If we're all worried about inflation, we might actually make it worse just by reacting to that fear.
That's a great point. It highlights how economics isn't just about numbers and charts. It's about human behavior expectations and how we respond to uncertainty.
Okay, so we need to factor in all these layers of complexity. But how do we actually do that? Do we just need to add more variables to the Phillips curve equation? Make it a bigger, fancier model?
It's not just about making the model more complicated. It's about recognizing that the relationship between inflation and unemployment is dynamic and constantly changing. There's no one-size-fits-all answer, and what works in one situation might not work in another.
So it's more about understanding the principles and then applying them to specific situations, kind of like, I don't know, a doctor diagnosing a patient. They have to consider the whole person, not just the symptoms, right?
That's a great analogy. And it brings us back to those tariffs. Let's think about how policymakers are likely to respond to the potential economic impacts we've been discussing.
All right, let's get practical here. What tools do they have to work with?
One of the main tools is monetary policy, which is controlled by central banks like the Federal Reserve here in the U.S. They can adjust interest rates to try to influence inflation and economic growth. Think of it like this: the economy is a car and the Fed is the driver. If the car is going too fast, meaning inflation is getting out of control, the Fed can tap the brakes by raising interest rates.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah.
Slow things down to prevent a crash.
Yeah.
But couldn't that also cause problems? What if raising interest rates throws the economy into a stall?
That's the dilemma. Raising interest rates can also slow down economic growth and potentially lead to higher unemployment. It's that balancing act we keep coming back to, but with even higher stakes when you add in those tariffs.
It sounds like a real tightrope walk for policymakers. But what about other options? Can the government do anything directly to address the negative impacts of these tariffs?
There are things they could try, but those options also come with trade-offs. For example, they could provide subsidies or tax breaks to consumers to help offset the higher costs caused by the tariffs. But that would increase the government's budget deficit, which could lead to problems down the road.
Right, there's no such thing as a free lunch, even in economics. So it seems like policymakers are in a tough spot.
Yeah.
But what about businesses? How are they likely to respond to all of this?
Well, some businesses might actually see these tariffs as an opportunity. If those tariffs make foreign goods more expensive, domestic producers might have a chance to capture more market share. We could see companies moving production back to the U.S., investing in new technologies to become more efficient, or finding creative ways to adapt.
So potential winners and losers, depending on how companies play their cards. But what about the workers? They're the ones who ultimately feel the impact of these big economic shifts, right?
That's absolutely right. And unfortunately, there's no easy answer when it comes to how workers will be affected. Some workers might benefit from the tariffs if they're in industries that see increased demand, but others could face job losses or stagnant wages if their industries are negatively impacted.
So it's a mixed bag for workers, just like it is for businesses. What can workers do to prepare for all this uncertainty?
This is where things like education training and skills development become crucial. Workers need to be adaptable and prepared for the jobs of the future, which might look very different from the jobs of today. It's not just about learning specific skills, it's about developing a mindset of lifelong learning and being able to adjust to change.
So it's not just about what you know, it's about your ability to keep learning and evolving.
Exactly. And this is something policymakers need to be thinking about too. How can we support workers through these transitions and make sure they have the tools they need to thrive in a changing economy? It's about investing in education, providing training opportunities, and creating policies that help workers adapt and succeed.
Okay, so we've got businesses adjusting, workers adapting, and policymakers trying to steer the ship through choppy waters. Sounds like a lot of moving parts. Where does the Phillips Curve fit into all this?
Well, despite its limitations, the Phillips Curve can still help us make sense of these complex forces and how they might play out in the real world. It reminds us that inflation and unemployment are intertwined, and that decisions made by governments, businesses, and individuals can have ripple effects throughout the economy.
It's like a reminder that everything is connected, and that even seemingly small changes can have big consequences.
That's a great way to put it. But there's another side to this interconnectedness that we need to consider. It's not just about the domestic economy. We live in a globalized world, and what happens in other countries can have a significant impact on what happens here. And that brings us to another big question.
We were just talking about how everything's connected in economics.
Yeah.
And I guess that's especially true in today's globalized world. So how do we even begin to predict what's going to happen when you factor in events happening all over the planet?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? It's almost like trying to predict the weather. You know, there are so many variables at play, and even like tiny changes can lead to huge and unexpected outcomes.
So are you saying we should just throw up our hands and admit we have no clue what's coming next?
Not necessarily. It's not about predicting the future with perfect accuracy.
Oh, yeah.
It's more about understanding the underlying trends and being prepared for different scenarios,
Right.
kind of like a chess player
Right.
who thinks several moves ahead.
Okay, so instead of trying to predict the exact outcome, we need to focus on understanding the game itself.
Exactly. And that starts with recognizing that the economy is a global system now.
Right.
What happens in China, Europe, or anywhere else
Yeah.
can have ripple effects that impact us here.
So something like a recession in Europe could actually affect the Phillips curve here in the U.S.
Absolutely. A recession in Europe could mean decreased demand for American goods,
Right.
which could lead to slower economic growth
Right.
and potentially job losses here.
It's like a chain reaction.
Yeah.
But how do we keep track of all these potential chain reactions happening all over the world?
Well, that's where things get really challenging.
Yeah.
It requires constant monitoring analysis
Right.
and a willingness to adjust our thinking as new information emerges.
So we need to stay flexible and maybe a little bit humble,
Uh-huh.
recognizing that we don't have all the answers.
That's a great way to put it. And it highlights the importance of considering different perspectives and challenging our own assumptions.
Okay, I'm starting to see how this all ties together. We've got the Phillips curve as this underlying framework for understanding inflation and unemployment. We need to factor in things like globalization, technology, and even psychology. And then we have to be aware of how events happening all over the world can impact the situation here at home.
You got it. And to make things even more interesting, we've got those tariffs thrown into the mix.
Right, those tariffs. It's almost like President Trump threw a wrench into an already complex machine.
Right.
What are some key things we should be watching for as this all plays out?
Well, for starters, how will businesses actually respond to these tariffs in the long run?
Okay.
Will they reshore production, invest in automation, or find other creative ways to adapt? And how will those decisions impact workers in different industries?
It makes sense. We talked earlier about how there could be winners and losers,
Right.
depending on how companies respond. But what about the impact on consumers? How will they react to potentially higher prices?
That's another big question. Will they cut back on spending, demand higher wages, or shift their buying habits? And how will those reactions affect overall economic growth and inflation?
It's like a giant puzzle with all these interconnected pieces.
Mm-hmm.
And then, of course, there's the question of how policymakers will respond to all of this. Will they prioritize fighting inflation, supporting employment, or try to find some kind of compromise?
It's a complex balancing act, and there are no easy answers.
Right.
But by understanding the forces at play, we can at least start to ask the right questions and prepare for different possibilities.
So we may not be able to predict the future with certainty,
Right.
but we can at least try to understand the game and make informed decisions based on the best available information.
Exactly. And ultimately, that's what economics is all about. It's about making choices in a world of scarcity and uncertainty and trying to create the best possible outcomes for ourselves, our communities, and the world around us.
This has been a truly eye-opening deep dive. I feel like I have a much better grasp of the Phillips curve, the potential impact of these tariffs, and just how complex and interconnected the global economy really is.
I'm glad to hear that. And remember, the learning never stops. The more we explore, the more we realize how much more there is to discover.
Well said. And on that note, we've reached the end of our deep dive for today. Thank you for joining us on this journey, and we hope you'll continue to explore the fascinating world of economics with us in future episodes.
Until next time, keep asking questions, keep challenging assumptions, and keep learning. Because in a world that's constantly changing, knowledge is our most valuable asset.